Hello and welcome to this episode of Futures, the podcast series brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply.
Hello everybody, I'm Ben Farrell, I'm the CEO of CIPS, and welcome to the CIPS Futures podcast, a very, very special edition today. And as part of the great conversation, we're exploring what makes the next generation of leaders. And I'm so thrilled because it's a subject so close to my heart, and the great conversation is in full swing now that we've got Mike Soutar, who many of the UK audience will know as the forensic interviewer on The Apprentice, but also has an extraordinary distinguished career in UK in publishing and some of the best known publications many of us will recognize from some years ago, like FHM Smash Hits and Nuts, etc. And has this week been around, having just launched his book, The Next Generation CEO. And so huge, warm welcome to Mike, friend of CIPS. It's brilliant that you're here today.
Oh, Ben, thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and speaking to you. I had such great fun when I came and spoke at your conference a few months ago now. Such a brilliant audience, had so many great questions.
It's perfect timing in every way, because like you, and in a second we come back to the sort of motivation to write the book now at this stage. We've been conducting this great conversation because I believe there's a point of evolution, that the level of change we're experiencing in society generally across the globe necessitates us to take a moment of time to make sure we're fit for the future. And so there's a synergy in the conversations we're all having. And part of our great conversation, not only about the skills, but the nature of leadership of the future. So it's time to perfection. And thank you very much. In that vein, I was intrigued to know whether, from your personal perspective, you've been a deliberate student of leadership all your life, or what was it that made you particularly interested in this subject at this stage of your career?
Thank you, Ben. And it's a really good question. I was kind of thrust into a leadership role when I was relatively young. I was 23 years old when I inherited the editorship of Smash Hits, and that was in the very early 1990s. And at the time, there were 28 staff there, and all but 3 of them were older and more experienced than I was. They had more years under their belt of journalism and their craft skill. So I suppose out of necessity, I had to kind of study hard and not just think about my own leadership journey, but that of others. And I've always been very lucky to have mentors and coaches and people who have given me time and advice when I've reached out, to ask for their help. And so I suppose so many of the kind of foundational lessons that I learned were through doing that, making the mistakes that you make when you first kind of stumble into a leadership role, being humble enough to recognize when you make those mistakes rather than pig-headed about it and think, well, everybody else is wrong, I must be right. Learning how not to be performative as a leader, but learning how to kind of lead with kind of a genuine authenticity. And I suppose kind of behind those euphemisms, what does that really mean in kind of real life? So it's been something, that I have experienced and enjoyed. And, towards the later parts of my career, and I always think of myself as being in the second chapter now of my career, as a portfolio director, and I kind of have a plural set of interests. But one of the things that I do as part of that is I now, mentor and coach and advise leaders when either there's an amazing opportunity and they want to maximize it, or there's a problem that they've got that they need to try and find a way around. And I always have to stop myself saying, well, if I was you, because that's not what they're interested in, but to ask good questions, to ask good long-term, bigger questions that in the heat of the moment, sometimes we're just human beings. We don't necessarily consider things outside of the kind of immediate priorities that are in front of us, but to kind of ask good questions and to get leaders to answer those questions for themselves.
That's interesting. One of the things I've been very conscious of, and I sort of tried to, I suppose I've learned it when we've been going around the world with the great conversation, is listening to some of the quieter voices in the room or the younger generations as well. Anyway, I loved your book, and there's so much in there. It's absolute gold and so well done. So particularly, I just wanted to start with the three storms notion, and just to get perhaps your description to help people understand the perspective that the book lays out, and then we can talk about the implications for leadership of the future.
Yeah, listen, thank you. Yeah, so these are three storms of change. They are big global issues, but ones which impact leaders on a very personal and local level as well. And it's really why I decided that I felt that I had something I could say that was new and original and would be helpful. I did my research. There are something like 18,000 books available in the British Library with the word leadership in the title. So, if you're going to try and say something, then being aware that there are lots of opinions out there is a good place to start. But I didn't want to write about traditional leadership. What I wanted to write about was how leadership is changing now because of the impact of three very large storms, very, very considerable external forces which are impacting everything. The first, of course, is AI. And AI is entirely changing the nature of work, the way that work gets done, the value of work, and also the structure of the workplace. It is, I suspect, the most powerful single tool that has ever been introduced into the world in my lifetime. And I think we are just at the very start of that and the start of seeing how it is going to impact us. I think there are incredible opportunities, but also there are threats and risks involved in it, many of which we don't yet know. Secondly, the geopolitical landscape has changed massively. And I think leaders, even 5 years ago, were probably not thinking about the impact that wars that might happen in other parts of the world might affect their supply chains. They probably weren't thinking to such a great degree about how, non-physical conflicts, but the kind of culture conflicts that exist around gender and truth and identity and a number of other issues. They weren't really thinking about the ways that those were going to affect the way that they lead. But you've got this instability now in the world where old alliances have been junked, new ones are going to start, and we don't yet know how that is all going to play out. So a state of real flux there. And then finally, we have a new generation in the workforce. And this is a generation which bore the brunt of COVID in terms of the interruption to their lives, to the way that, we've kind of all grown up and made our mistakes in different ways in public, as we've grown up. And this is a COVID generation who are entering the workplace now, and they have different questions and different needs and different desires. And they're also, I think, unfortunately, on the tough end of a cost of living crisis. That old contract between employers and employees has changed massively. There used to be an understanding, didn't there, when, the old war horses, Ben, were entering the workplace. There was a sense that if you worked hard and you were loyal and you were committed, then the rewards would come your way. You'd have enough money to put down to get a mortgage on a house. You buy a car, you could start a family, you would have a holiday or two every year. You would have a reasonable standard of living that your work supported. And the cost of living has really changed that. And so therefore, I think you have a new generation in the workforce who are now questioning why it is that they are working over and above kind of the basic safety and remuneration that they get, because they're also on the hard end of AI. And AI is a force which will eat from the top as far as leaders are concerned, and will change there, and will also eat from the bottom. So any one of those big storms, I think, would cause leaders to have to review how they lead and to change how they lead. All three of them happening simultaneously mean, I think this is a moment to review leadership and how we approach it for a whole new era.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. context as we talk about the procurement career development, and people are anxious to know, the daily friction of your personal development, and you learn to make good judgment, as you were describing earlier, about your honing your leadership, or you're watching other leaders. And what does that mean in terms of how we get people who are proficient in the profession, whatever profession actually, in the coming years? Where do you get that experience to make those great judgments at the moment in time it comes? So it is, it's a question we're trying to answer in a way to say, what does the job of the future look like, and how do we equip people? So we're sort of in the middle of that conversation, and definitely welcome all perspectives on how we would say we're developing the leaders of the futures to become the future, to become the CEO of the future. And so we're thinking about how that might happen. I was going to ask about the idea of the three characteristics he describes of the future leaders, in the sense of recognizing, well, you'll be way better at describing it than me, but also not the CEO, not being the smartest person in the room, because that's going to be AI, but also the level of self-belief, optimism, which I completely, having been a soldier, and been in the hard yards, creating that, and then the work. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. So during the process of writing the book, it's 60 chapters. Some of them are, they're all pretty short and punchy. The longest one, I think, is 9 pages. The shortest one is 2 pages. And that's A, because that's the way I write, and B, because I think it's the way that time-pressed people consume, information and entertainment and everything. And I've got kind of 2 audiences here really in mind that I've had from the start. One are existing leaders right now who recognize that the world is changing and acknowledge that they need to find, a new edge in a changing world. And also those younger emerging leaders who may not have had the same level of help and support that some of us who've had longer careers have had. And they both have in common the fact that they are time pressed and they have short attention spans, in my experience. But I went around and I spoke to many different leaders, different entrepreneurial people, people from sports, everybody from, Alan Sugar, through to the commander of British Royal Navy nuclear submarine, who was second in command during a terrible potential accident. With all of the leaders, I spoke to them about how they viewed the characteristics that they believe are also required to be a successful leader in the future. And 3 just kept coming up the whole time, and I defined them as self-belief, relentless optimism, and the capacity for hard work. In terms of self-belief, I think none of us are born with self-belief. It's something that we grow over time. And it's a bit like a muscle. It's something that you have to constantly build and work on. And self-belief is not arrogance. Arrogance is a completely different characteristic. Self-belief is the ability to look in the mirror and objectively ask yourself, am I the right person to lead this project? Am I the right person to lead this organization and lead these people? And I think you build self-belief through doing difficult things, taking on difficult tasks and projects and getting through them and proving to yourself that you can do difficult things well. And it builds an amazing resilience. It builds a feeling of self-efficacy. And that has scientifically proven benefits. People with higher levels of self-efficacy try new things quicker. And when you fail, and you will fail, they bounce back quicker as well. Then there's relentless optimism. As we've discussed, we're going through now what will be an era of change where we don't know. Anybody who says they know what the world is going to look like in 10 years' time, I simply don't believe them. I think there are too many variables. I think there are different scenarios, but one thing we can say is it's not going to look like now. Now, to be a leader in changing times, you need to be an optimist because people don't follow pessimists. And what's the difference between optimism and naivety is a plan. You don't stand on the edge of the cliff and hope that suddenly you're going to sprout wings. You need a plan that gets you from A to B. And when you've got a plan, your optimism is authentic and shareable, and it inspires people. And then the last thing is the capacity for hard work. And I'm not talking about workaholism. Workaholics are dealing with other issues, I think. So I'm not talking about a kind of a toxic presenteeism and we all have to be here and we all have to knock our pans in and we all have to be martyrs about it. The fact is, with all of the successful leaders that I know, they all share the characteristic of working harder than almost anybody else around them. Those for me are the three characteristics. And there's a difference, right? Because I think you need lots of qualities to be a great leader. You know, you need empathy, you need to be decisive. You know, there are all sorts of qualities, but qualities are things that you have that maybe necessarily aren't things that people see. Characteristics are things that people see. And I think those three characteristics of self-belief, relentless optimism, the capacity for hard work are things that people need to see in you in order to believe you and follow you as a leader.
We'll be right back to the conversation in just a moment, but first, a quick message from our sponsor for this episode, Vantify. If you are responsible for supply chain management, you already know that probably compliant is not good enough. Vantify gives you real-time oversight of your service providers so you can command your supply chain. With a clear view of who's active, who's compliant, and who's a current risk, you can check documents, verify standards, and regain control. This makes it easy to appoint the right people at the right time. With supply chain data feeding directly into Vantify's CAFM and Risk Manager tools, you gain a clear overview of your risk and compliance. One ecosystem, compliance, connected. Visit vantify.com for more information. Now back to the episode.
What I loved about the book, and I think procurement supply people must read this book because you use a few of my favorite examples of leaders, Tim Cook, Mary Barra, and Ben Farrell, all talking about that they're supply chain people in their own way. It was brilliant. I appreciated that very much.
With supply chain data feeding directly into Vantify's CAFM and Risk Manager tools, you gain a clear overview of your risk and compliance.
Or the person you would recognize as
one more
a leader that you would follow above all else or above all others.
I think there's no one single person because I think you take characteristics and lessons from lots of different
With
ones.
supply chain data feeding directly into Vantify's CAFM and Risk Manager tools, you gain a clear overview of your risk and compliance.
Speaking to people, one of the stories that I kept coming back to and I've kind of enshrined in the book is that of Ben Francis, who you mentioned. And Ben, for anybody who hasn't followed his story, is the young, very successful British entrepreneur behind Gymshark. And, you know, when he was 19 years old and still delivering pizzas on the back of a bike for Pizza Hut, he used his mum's sewing machine to create gym wear because he was a gym bunny, basically. That was what all his friends did. And he thought, I don't really like all the stuff that's available. He did that. He very early on had a real space rocket of a product that people just picked up on and absolutely loved. And it catapulted him from kind of the garage of his parents' home to getting space and hiring friends and doing all this. And the company organically grew incredibly quickly. So by the time he was 23, he was running a business which was turning over already more than £100 million a year, which was largely online, which had a couple of hundred employees, and he was the CEO, and he did a really grown-up thing. He decided that he would have an external company come in and run a 360 appraisal. And the results of the feedback from his reports and peers came in. And I've had this happen to me, so I totally get it. He read it and went, what? That's not me. The picture that it painted of the person, he was just like, this is terrible. And he started to do that thing where he kind of went through it, went, I know who wrote that. I'll get them. And he was at home and he thought, and he was so frustrated by this kind of monstrous caricature that he felt was being portrayed. He kind of left the report on the side and went to the gym. Of course he would. And, you know, worked out and kind of got it out of his system and got home, but still kind of burning about how bad this feedback was. And he went, and he got home and he was about to say to his partner, she was there, she was just putting the report down that he left on the side that she'd obviously read. And he was about to say, look at that. It's ridiculous, isn't it? And she turned around to him and she said, Ben, that's the most you thing I've ever read. And he did something that I think is extraordinary, which is he decided at that point that he was not the very best CEO that his organization could have in order to lead it forward into the future. And he went out and he recruited somebody with more experience than him that he felt had the right attitude. He gave them the role of CEO. He decided that he was not going to overrule them even at any point, even though he was the majority shareholder in the business. And he demoted himself to the role of head of brand. And then, really extraordinarily, he did the same thing again. He hired a deputy, and he recognized that deputy had skills and an aptitude that was greater than his. So he again gave the deputy his job as head of brand, and moved on to a different part of the business. And he spent 4 years working through his business. And then at the end of that 4 years, he decided that, yes, he felt ready to run the business again. By which time, Gymshark was an absolute monster. And again, he was the majority shareholder. So here's the thing that two things really impressed me. One is his humility to do that in the first place, rather than just buggering on, as almost anybody else I know, and probably myself, would have done. And secondly, the fact that at the point where the company was running perfectly without him, he didn't need to take the stress and the strain stepping up to the top job. He could frankly have gone and bought a yacht and drunk, Krug champagne for breakfast for the rest of his life. He chose to take on the strain and stress of being a leader because he felt that he wanted to be the best leader that organization could possibly have. I'm so inspired by his story because it's about asking the right questions, about curiosity, about, combining kind of technological literacy with emotional intelligence, by having clarity that starts with you and your own understanding of your own leadership qualities and what needs to work before you move out from there. And so for me, I think if anybody wanted to look at a model of somebody with that kind of startling humility, then I would start with Ben Francis.
That's fantastic. It made me think a little bit, as I'd not really heard the breadth of that story at all before, and it is extraordinary, really, isn't it? As you say, I would have been the annoying person who thought I knew the answers. Do you know what I mean? And pushed on. And so it's such a good lesson. It made me think. You're talking about 18,000 books on leadership. I spent a bit of time looking at followership as well as a skill, as a concept of how you would be a good follower in the organization. And then I was connecting the dots together with your reference to radiators and drains in organizations. So maybe you could say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in all organizations, you broadly speaking have two sorts of people, radiators and drains. Radiators, as the name would suggest, are people who push more energy into the organization than they consume. And drains are people who consume more energy than they radiate. And that just tends to be a mindset that makes people that way. Sometimes I think there's nurture in there that turns them at times to act more as drains than as radiators. And I've found over time, it's best not to judge too quickly because people can vacillate between one state and the other. But when somebody is in drain state, they can just be hard work. Do you know what I mean? They can just be very high maintenance. And the way that I've discovered over the years to tackle that is to have them, when a challenge comes up, when a stressful point comes up where they're faced with a challenge that they feel they can't get past, that tends to be them at their worst. And the way that I have learned to coach those people is, in the first instance, to get them to pause, take a moment to think about this and step back a little bit, give themselves some objectivity, and then try and frame the problem that they've got in place as a constructive challenge to get around, to come up with a realistic plan to get around there. And I found that often takes the edge off somebody's ability to accidental ability often to go and then upset lots of other people around them. Do you know what I mean? So it's recognizing that moment, stepping in, intervening, a little bit of personal coaching at that point to get them to view the challenge as a positive, to get them to think about the positive end point of that will often transform them. And that's so much better for the entire workplace because drains take your momentum away. And momentum is ultimately the key asset in any organization. It's so difficult to get. Once you've got it, you have to. It's a leader's, it's a CEO's, I think, first job, most important job, is to wake up in the morning and think, how do I maintain and increase the momentum in the direction of this organization? Because as the CEO, you are the single person who does this. You talked, Ben, a bit earlier on about how the contagious nature of leaders. If your contagious nature is to create momentum, other people will follow. They will push that along. They will take that as their own mission. If you forget that, even for a moment, then that's the point where things start to slow down. And once an organization has slowed down, the friction that exists underneath it, just pure physics terms, it's almost impossible to get it moving again.
No, I'm completely with you on the momentum. It was even interesting when I was left the army and I was in retail for a while, and how a brand got momentum and it's intangible, and the sense of it, and it was pervasive in the sense of internally and externally, people felt the same. And it is almost an emotion in itself, which is interesting, isn't it? And you build reputation on it and you think, well, why is it slipping away? There's no obvious answer perhaps, but perhaps it is about the leader and the persona, their self-belief about the organization at the same time. So, we're finding it great at the moment because procurement supply is so relevant to the world that we're in. And increasingly, these are the skills of the future.
When I think about procurement people, I think there are so many skills that procurement professionals have had to develop to be successful in their roles that are, again, for the future, or for the future of organizations and the future of leaders, I think are just really critical. When I kind of think about it, it's procurement leaders already see the whole machine rather than one department. They understand interdependence, trade-offs, the unintended consequences of decisions. In many ways, procurement leaders are already practicing the sorts of systems of leadership that the future demands. Most executives see kind of the organization chart, and that's their starting point. Procurement leaders, in my experience, see the supply chains and the interdependence of relationships. And in this more ambiguous, more flexible, faster changing world, that is the core skill.
It definitely is. And when we look at the nature of business, how when I was, for example, worked at John Lewis, I started there 2011, there must be about 8 different digital businesses helping, growth online. And by the time I left a couple of years ago, there's about 250. So all the time we're managing the supplier base. The nature of business is big ecosystem. And these are the skills of organizational relevance. And that's why I was thinking that Tim Cook at Apple, he bought essentially a big, vast, extended enterprise together to deliver extraordinary outcomes. But it was actually the skills that he developed through understanding supply and procurement that allowed him to run an organization as effectively as he did. What do you think is, when you've been talking to people, perhaps even on The Apprentice or, in your daily life, if you were able to spot a character trait, an individual thing that you thought that young person has, the potential to be a sort of next gen CEO, is there anything that immediately strikes you?
When I'm talking to anybody, but, in particular kind of young people about what their ambitions are, the ones that always really impress me that I think they're going to go a long way are the ones who have already started to think about the context of what, if they want to launch a new business, what's the competitive landscape looking like here? What's the broader context? It's very easy when you're in a role because people are measured on task output to focus solely on that. And sometimes people can get quite a long way. They can be really well promoted because they're absolutely brilliant at excellent to delivery in a short time frame. They're trustworthy and everything else. But often they can lose that all-important peripheral vision. And I think it's one of the things, I think if there was anything that in discussions I've had with people who work in procurement who express frustration that sometimes they're regarded as incredibly reliable, will always get the job done, do you know what I mean? Extraordinarily accountable for what they do, can always give you the answer. But, do they have vision? It's the other side of the coin, isn't it? It's the curse that comes with being, from a craft skill perspective, so very adept. And I think that's one of the things that having procurement leaders think about the peripheral vision and talk about those things. So, to stop talking about pure procurement and to start talking about growth, resilience, risk, to give a business perspective over and above the functional update that's so important. CEOs are often the people who understand how value is created across an entire enterprise, and procurement people are perfectly well situated to talk about that, but need to talk about it in visionary terms, I think, but also in terms of those alliances that sit outside. Your procurement leaders will typically be the best connected, certainly with suppliers, the best connected people in the entire organization. So therefore, bringing into that boardroom, being regarded as being a future CEO, actually, that's it. That's their secret weapon, is they can say, well, let me tell you how it's working elsewhere. Because everybody else in the room, they don't have that depth of insight into other organizations, into peer organizations, because they're not spending their days measuring the effectiveness of peers and competitors like procurement professionals are.
I loved, by the way, I was so interested in bringing your whole self, the authenticity trap. Would you say something about your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think there was a trend, I think, a few years ago, which was to do with bringing your whole self to work. The idea that people don't believe in leaders who appear to be kind of one-dimensional, and so therefore, that was to do with kind of I think throwing off the chains of a traditional suit-wearing caricature of a leader. So there was something that was very constructive, very positive about that whole movement. The problem is, I think it was hijacked by people who thought, "Oh, brilliant! I'm a leader, but now I can just be myself the whole time because I'm bringing my whole self to work." And actually, I had a row this morning with my partner. I'm feeling a bit depressed about that. I'm a little bit worried about money. I'm a bit short this month, and I'm kind of having a bit of an existential crisis. I don't think that is bringing your whole self to work, even though literally that's what you're doing. I think your prime responsibility as a leader is to be able to switch off from the distractions of the outside, to be able to be a warm, rounded individual. But I think that's to do with being able to speak your mind and encouraging other people to do so. Having an organization where you allow the vulnerability is not having to be right the whole time. It's the trap that leaders fall into, isn't it? Which is that sense that people expect them to always have the answers and to always be right. That's not what good leaders are or can be in the uncertain future that we face. So being authentic and you bring your best self to the organization, not your whole self. And your best self is somebody who empowers other people, who asks questions, who has a relentless curiosity in other people, who gets the best out of people that way. That, I think, is bringing your best self. Because at the end of the day, again, back to your analogy of leadership being a contagious thing, if you start to leak out emotionally everywhere, then everybody else will as well. You're giving everybody permission to do that, and that can be tremendously distracting. Taking your whole self and focusing it into your best self, that's, I think, a great way to be a leader.
That's fantastic. I like the idea of constructive dissent, as by the way, as encouragement. I'm always trying to do that.
there's a test for whether you have generated a genuine ecosystem or culture of constructive dissent. And that is to ask yourself, how many of my ideas didn't get through, right? And if you've lost more arguments than you win, if you've changed your mind during the day, then you've got that. If things always turned out like you expected they would when you first started to think about them, it is likely you do not have a culture of constructive dissent because you haven't empowered people enough to challenge you and to persuade you otherwise.
Yeah, so interesting. I think, Mike, I mean, fabulous. Love the book. So interesting, so of the moment. I've been thinking, and I'd love, as a sort of final perspective, about CIPS for a global organization. And obviously as a leader of the global organization, I'm distant from everybody's life, not everybody's life every day, but often for long periods of time. So I'm always thinking about how do I create the conditions for a thriving organization at distance, and I don't think Zoom calls are the answer necessarily, but I'd love your view on that type of leadership, which is relevant to the world we're in today.
It's a great question. There was one of the things that I write about in one of the longer chapters is having a blind framework. I think when you have a blind framework, it means that you have to expressly articulate how your expectations and how you do things. And I think the best example that I found, which I write about in the book, is GitLab, a SaaS business where the two founders of the business in the beginning were people who lived more than 600 miles away from each other. And so they kind of couldn't be together. And they started on day one writing a handbook. That handbook is now more than 2,000 pages. And because they're so transparent, it's available. You can just go online, look at GitLab handbook, and they have written down and documented every single process that they use within the organization. They now have thousands of full-time employees around the world who don't work from offices. They do meet up. I mean, they give them a fund to go and meet other people. Do you know what I mean? So once a month, you can spend a few £100 going and traveling and meeting a colleague. They do all sorts of things around that. But it's an extraordinary. It even has company songs in it. I mean, they've even written the lyrics to some really cheesy company songs in. So a blind framework, I guess, is a way in which you expressly articulate everything that you do and how you do it. And then you let the handbook live. So you allow people to update it. It's a living document that exists. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary piece of work. I suspect that's the best way. I think we're going to, in the long term, I think hybrid organizations are difficult. I think they're the most challenging ones to lead. Fully remote or fully all in, I think those are much easier to lead. The ones that are hybrid, where some people are in, some people aren't, some people are in some days and some people aren't. I think those are the ones that are most difficult because the tools exist and the cultures exist for fully remote and fully in work. The middle part is the most difficult.
Yeah, very challenging. Is even in a meeting, a mixed meeting is difficult enough sometimes, isn't it? It's very, very difficult. I think we better draw it to a close, but I'm immensely excited about the book, and thank you so much for your time today. Really enjoyed our conversation. We could go on for hours, frankly, because it is a subject that's so super relevant to all that's going on. And congratulations for bringing it all together in such a brilliant way. And
thank you.
Looking forward to continuing the conversation in different ways. And I just wanted to end by encouraging everybody, who's listening to contribute to the great conversation. There are a million different ways. And also buy this excellent book, which is available, I can tell you right now, available on Amazon across the globe, here and now. And it's so worth it. So thank you to everybody. And let's continue because at the heart of this sits, not just the development of the profession, but the prosperity and success of wider organizations. So this incredibly important subject. Fab, Mike, have a most glorious weekend and lovely to see you. Hopefully catch up again soon.
Brilliant, Ben. Thank you so much. I so appreciate it. Thank you.